Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Serena Longo, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Kevin Birmingham, presenting his new book, The Sinner and the Saint, joined in conversation by Matthew Pearl. Thanks so much for joining us virtually this evening. Harvard Bookstore's virtual event series continues this winter, bringing authors and their work to our community and our digital community. Our winter series is wrapping up as we head into the holidays, but we will soon be posting our 2022 beginning events. So just find our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and shop our shelves from home. Our newsletter is the best way to stay abreast of all of our events as we post them. We hope that you'll sign up. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We'll get through as many as time allows. This event also will have auto-generated closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. You can also disable captions there as well. In the chat, I'll be posting links to purchase The Sinner and the Saint on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you all for tuning in and purchasing books. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And so now I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. Kevin Birmingham is the New York Times bestselling author of The Most Dangerous Book, which won the PEN New England Award and the Truman Capote Award for Literary Criticism. He has been named a public scholar by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and his writing has appeared in Harper's, New York Times Book Review, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Joining him on our digital stage this evening is bestselling novelist and writer Matthew Pearl, author of The Dante Club, The Last Buccaneer, and The Taking of Jemima Boone, among many other titles. They'll be discussing Kevin's new book, The Sinner and the Saint, Dostoevsky, and the gentleman murderer who inspired a masterpiece. The Atlantic calls it an inspired account of the genesis, philosophical and neurological, of crime and punishment, and Boris Fishman writes for the New York Times Book Review. Birmingham has alchemized scholarship into a magisterially immersive, novelistic account of the author's life, a magnificent and fitting tribute. We're so pleased to be hosting this event tonight. The digital podium is yours, Kevin and Matthew.
Thank you. Thanks so much to Serena and to Harvard Bookstore. And I'm so happy to be part of the event introducing Kevin and your book, which I happen to have right here, The Sinner and the Saint. And first
it's a great cover. The cover is one of the best parts of the book.
Well, we could start there since you brought it up, and I'm always interested in covers, having worked on a number of books and going through the cover. So was this the first draft, so to speak, the first and final design of the cover? Were you happy with it right away? I will say once I got a cover that I was very unhappy with, but then by the next day I really liked it. So sometimes it's also just that disorientation of seeing it for the first time. What was your kind of relationship to this cover?
I loved it. It was I think we might have made a couple of very, very small changes, but I thought the cover was brilliant. What you're looking at is the image is part of the illustrated story about Lacenaire that Dostoevsky read. So he read it in a compendium of true crime stories that was written in French. And alongside the stories were various illustrations. And this is an image of Lacenaire, and you can see he is attacking a woman on the right, just at the edge of the cover. There is a sleight of hand that's done here, though, with the cover, which is that the figure is holding an axe, but in the original, And what's true to real life is he's not holding an axe, he's holding a three-sided file, which he used to kill an old woman, and his partner is using an axe. And that's just to the, it's not on the cover, but it's his partner's in the background, busy killing someone with an axe. So the idea of an axe murderer, which is now, I suppose, a cliche, was relatively astonishing at the time, and Lacenaire and his partner's crimes were probably one of the main reasons why that came to be such a well-known trope.
And we'll talk about all this, but just so nobody gets lost, Lacenaire is a figure in France who commits this crime that's depicted here that will inspire Crime and Punishment. And am I right? In Crime and Punishment, we do have the axe recur, right?
Yes, right. So the book, The Sinner and the Saint, tells two stories. One is the story of Dostoevsky as a young writer, getting his bearings, all the trials and tribulations that he went through, including being arrested in the middle of the night, having a mock execution. He thought he was going to die, and then being shipped off to Siberia for about a decade. And his career leading up to the writing of Crime and Punishment. It goes back and forth between that story and the story of Pierre-François Lacenaire, who was a murderer in 1830s Paris. And what was astonishing about Lacenaire was that he was charismatic, that he was heartless in his crimes, that he would kill without remorse, without compunction. He said, "I would kill a man as I drink a glass of wine." But the thing that disturbed Dostoevsky the most is that there were some people in Paris who were captivated by him, that effectively admired him. They were visiting him in his prison cell before he got guillotined. He was guillotined in 1835. People were sending him gifts. They were sending him flowers and writing him poetry. And he effectively became a celebrity. A wax likeness of his head was made just after he was guillotined. And the sculptor used real hair and whiskers to make the image complete. And crowds of people came to see it. A mummified hand of his was circulating in literary Paris in the years after his execution. So when Dostoevsky read about this, he sort of thought of the Lacenaire case as being a signal about what was potentially wrong with Europe, that there was something rotten to the core of Europe. And it was a warning sign for him, because Russia at the time was trying to figure out which direction it would take, whether it would be more European or whether it would be more true, I suppose, to its Slavic roots. And Dostoevsky wanted to caution against both of those paths because he thought they were both fraught with some danger.
So that's, I think, a great way to introduce the book. You also wrote an article just a few days ago that appeared in Slate. For anyone who wants to get a little bit of a taste of the story before they crack open this book, which has just been wonderfully received. So congratulations both on the publication and on that reception. It's really being greeted as a triumph largely by your mother and your wife.
She's my biggest fan, and
yeah,
she's a tough fan.
But also places like the New York Times, which is also really really exciting. So you just gave us a bit of a taste of how the source material helped to spark the idea of Crime and Punishment, which of course then goes on to influence and inspire so much other literature. Mm-hmm. What about you in coming to your ideas generally, and specifically in this one? Is there a certain way you approach material to kind of test it out, to sort of experiment with the raw material to see if you're going to find the right ingredients to launch a project like this? Because something like this takes years, and I know this firsthand because we very often meet at a coffee shop or a restaurant, and we work on our projects sort of side by side or computer to computer. And so I do take some credit for saving your kind of guarding your computer as you
We
go
should, yeah.
get
You're
a coffee or
basically a
something.
co-author.
Yeah.
We should have put you on the cover.
So kind of any specific things that pop to mind in terms of the genesis of this book, and then how long did the process for this one take?
So for a long time I've wanted to write about Dostoevsky, but I couldn't think of an original way of talking about him. And I initially became interested by reading his biography. Joseph Frank wrote a 5-volume biography of Dostoevsky. It's about 2,500 pages, so it's as substantial a biography as you can possibly get. And Dostoevsky had an incredible life. He was celebrated as Russia's next great novelist at the tender age of 24. Before he had even published his first book, it was circulating. He wrote his first novella called Poor Folk, which no one reads anymore, but it was circulating in an unpublished form in literary circles. And Russia's main critic, Belinsky, was enamored with it and started trumpeting Dostoevsky's name in literary circles. Fast forward 4 years, and Dostoevsky's reputation is, and he starts delving into politics slightly. He's involved in what you could call a progressive reading group that was interested in discussing forbidden ideas and reading banned books in Tsarist Russia. There was a spy that was hidden in their midst. And so one morning before police, and he was arrested. He underwent a mock execution. He thought he was going to die. They tied 3 men to the stakes, put hoods on them. He was next in line. The firing squad took aim, and at the last minute, the Tsar's envoy galloped into the square and said that instead of being executed, you're going to be sent to Siberia. So he spent 10 years in Siberia. 4 of those years were in a hard labor camp where he met criminals and murderers and spoke with them at length about their crimes and what it felt like to kill people. He was fascinated. He had a morbid curiosity. And so when he came back to Russia in 1860, he was effectively starting his career over. And so virtually everything that you read from Dostoevsky was actually written in that period after Siberia, after his perceptions of things had changed, and after the trials of Siberia. He was addicted to gambling, which we'll talk about. He had temporal lobe epilepsy. He was chronically in debt. And the writing of Crime and Punishment itself is a drama. And part of what I wanted to do with the book is to tell that drama, to sort of figure out how Dostoevsky's creativity worked, and that would be my lens into Dostoevsky as a person. When I realized through Joseph Frank that Lacenaire was a partial inspiration for Crime and Punishment, I started to dig into him. Joseph Frank, as massive as biography is, only talks about Lacenaire for 1 paragraph. But then I realized very quickly that Lacenaire wrote his own memoirs in the weeks between his trial and his execution. And once I read the memoirs, I realized I had the ingredients for a story, that it could be a story with 2 lenses. And Dostoevsky's archive is vast. And part of what I think I need in order to write a book is an archive that's deep enough to allow me to go into the lives of people and to get as close to their interior lives as possible.
Yeah, and I think the description you have, the depiction of that mock execution, is so powerful and really surprising. And for me, it's kind of very emblematic of all the different themes and drama that's built into this book. Something I was very surprised by was that Dostoevsky's father was murdered, right? Or we think that it's very possible, right? That
was rumored to have been murdered. We don't know for sure what happened to him. The version of the story that he was told, he was at the engineering academy at the time, so he was just a teenager. He was effectively orphaned at the age of 17 because his mother died when he was 15. But the story that he heard was that his father was murdered by the family serfs. The family had about a couple of dozen serfs, and he was traumatized by that. And it's part of what likely fueled his his anti-serfdom stance, not that he needed his father to be murdered by serfs in order to hold that stance. But, one of the things that makes Crime and Punishment such a gripping murder story is that Dostoevsky very explicitly and very deeply felt what it was like to be on both sides of the murder equation, right? What it was like to be a victim of murder, both because he thought his father was murdered and because he thought he himself was going to be executed, that he was going to be killed. And so, he thought that he was breathing his last breaths. Once he went to Siberia, he was encountering murderers and was always asking them questions about why they did it. And there were always different answers, but it did come down to him to a thrilling sense of freedom that he thought that the murderers were experiencing, this brief moment of release for a life that was otherwise riddled with hardship and with a sort of lack of freedom in general. And I think, personally, that Dostoevsky himself had violent impulses. There were violent impulses that he, of course, was able to control, and he hated himself for having those violent impulses. But writing for him was a form of exorcism to some degree. It was a way to explore those murderous impulses, to explore the fear of being murdered, all without actually having to enter into that awful calculation.
And I'm very spoiled tonight because I get to ask you whatever questions I want, but I want to remind everyone that there's a Q&A. I think Serena mentioned this at the bottom of the screen. And please, as we're talking, please add any questions in particular, but comments too, and we'll save time for that later. So part of what makes Crime and Punishment special, and I mean, maybe I'm stealing this idea from you, but it seems to me that the fact that he believed his father was murdered, whether well, I guess we'll never know, right, what happened to his father, but he believed, right, that his father was murdered. That said, he would never know the reason. He would never know the full motivation. Maybe it was random. Maybe it was sort of socioeconomic in terms of the serfs who were rebelling. Maybe it was political, right? So it almost seems to me that void of understanding why this murder happened to this central person in his life, right, sort of is part of this journey that he takes.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you read Crime and Punishment carefully, one of the things that you'll notice is what's missing. And one of the things that's missing or not talked about is Raskolnikov's father. And Raskolnikov's father has died, but is never talked about. It's mentioned maybe once and very, very briefly. But there's one thing that Raskolnikov has left of his father, and it's a silver watch. And that's what he pawns to the pawnbroker that he will eventually kill. It's that silver watch that he wants back after she's dead. And that little narrative element is what draws him into the next phase of the story, which involves Raskolnikov trying to escape the inspector, Porfiry Petrovich, and it becomes, a detective story. And there's this sort of tango between Raskolnikov and the inspector throughout much of the novel. But it's the reason why he's in touch with him in the first place is because he wants to get that watch back. And it's this pain of a missing father that seems to be in the background of Dostoevsky's life, and part of why he's so adrift. He's in a city, St. Petersburg, as opposed to being out in the provinces where his mother and sister are. So he's a young man who's adrift, and it's a novel about a young man who wants to be good, who formulates ideas about how to be good, but has no feeling for goodness. And that's the big danger that Dostoevsky is trying to show us, that if you want to reason your way towards goodness, you're always going to fail. If you don't have a feeling for it, some basic feeling, some basic empathy, some connection to the people around you, if you don't have that, it's going to fail. And when people talk about how Crime and Punishment is implicitly a commentary about the politics of the time, that's partly what he's thinking about. He's taking a look at the radicals in Russia at the time, and he's seeing young men and women because there are plenty of women who were nihilists, as they were called as well. And they had theories about how to change society and how to be good people, but they were top heavy. They weren't really grounded in a sense of feeling for the people around them.
You know, it's part of what makes it so interesting to read your account is that we're reading about a writer, not just how he's discovering the material that will inspire this iconic piece of literature in Crime and Punishment, but also, as you've mentioned, the sort of incredibly draining and dramatic and challenging events that he's going through, many of which we just don't usually associate with writers. You know, I think many of us think of writers as leading pretty stable, at least these days, boring, you know, like you and me,
Right.
lives, right?
When we go to the cafe, that's the biggest excitement of the day.
But you know, funny enough, when we first met, or early on, after we had become friends, we had a little poker group.
That's right.
And I really was not very good at it. I never played poker. You helped teach me, and now I've forgotten it.
You wanted to split the pot. Oh, you were risk averse.
Oh yes, right. Because this is a bit of a tangent, not to make this about me, but since you made it about me, yeah, I don't like anything competitive. So like, I can't really play board games, even Monopoly.
Right.
I just can't, because I don't want to win. Even like tennis, I just want the other person.
You just want it to end.
Right, which is convenient because I'm not good at any of those games either, and I wasn't very good at poker. But it makes me think of Dostoevsky's Gambling, right. And I wonder if you could just say a word or two about what, you know, because again, it's not something you necessarily associate with a writer. Sort of what kind of gambler he was, and maybe, you know, sort of what, you know, what kind of how that factors into the story overall.
Yeah. Well, so unlike you, Dostoevsky was addicted to risk in a way. High risk situations for him were exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. And for Dostoevsky, it's often difficult to prize those two apart. He played roulette and was immediately captivated by the game. And as time went on, his roulette playing got worse and worse. For Dostoevsky, it was a desperate attempt to gain some sense of control over his life, because his life was, you know, almost always spinning out of control. And I actually wanted to read a little bit about my account of Dostoevsky and gambling, because I think it's it's an important way for us to see how Dostoevsky felt and the problems that he faced. And so this is not going to be very long. I think, you know, readings over Zoom don't go very well when they last very long. So it'll just be, you know, a couple of paragraphs. But just to set the scene, you know, this is in 1863. Dostoevsky has reached another difficult point in his life. He had just started a magazine with his close brother, Mikhail, called Vremya, and Vremya, or otherwise known as Time in English, was banned by the Tsar. So his passion project with his brother had collapsed. He was burdened by debts. His wife had tuberculosis and it was getting very bad. And his instinct was to escape all of this, to try to get away. And he escaped to a casino. He escaped to Wiesbaden, Germany, and to the roulette tables. And so I opened chapter 14 with this description of Dostoevsky playing roulette. Winning at roulette is easy. The secret is to maintain complete control over your emotions at all times, to be a machine. You must have no feeling for all the francs and guilders and Napoleons raked in and shoveled out across the table. You must remain indifferent to the deliciously clinking gold and silver and the rising or falling stacks in front of you, so that when you see the wheel spinning and hear the ivory ball coursing around the track as the wagers accumulate, following it as it noses down into the wheel's bowl, tick, tack, tacking across the numbers, red, red, black, red. You can remain calm. And whether it hunkers into 31 or skips belatedly to 27, you will not be disturbed. You will keep your head. For days, Dostoevsky watched hundreds of gamblers muscling their way through the crowd to place bets. Rouge, Ampere, Monk. Some of them recorded the results in notepads and scanned for patterns. A streak of reds, 2 11s, a full hour without a single zero. This was helpful. But most gamblers are impetuous. They come and go like pebbles on the shore. To win, you have to play for days, endure hundreds of spins, thousands. You have to ride out the bad turns patiently so that you can take advantage when the momentum shifts. Resolve like that requires an iron constitution. It requires determination and faith. Dostoevsky learned the secret to roulette by studying a Stoic French woman and an English lord who nearly broke the bank. If you could keep their level of imperturbable control, Dostoevsky explained in the letter, then it's impossible to lose and you're certain to win. He called it his system. Okay, so now if you ask Dostoevsky outside of a casino, back when he's at home in St. Petersburg, is it possible to win at roulette? He would have said no. The house always has the advantage. The advantage is the zero, by the way, which always goes to the house. But he always insisted when he was in the casino that he could. He thought that he had a magic formula for winning at roulette. And the magic formula was nothing more than what he called composure and calculation. All you had to do was remain calm. Now, he also knew that he was not calm at all, that he was always overtaken by his own emotions. He also knew that he was not rational, that he was completely irrational. In fact, it's part of the backbone of his fiction is to see humanity, to see human nature as being fundamentally irrational. And yet he kept convincing himself that he could rationally find his way out. That's the heartbreaking part of Dostoevsky's career, that even when you know deep down that you're an irrational creature, you still won't be more rational because of that knowledge. You're always trapped inside this cycle of irrationality. And so he kept going back to the casino again and again, learning the same lesson and forgetting it. Now, he happened to win on that trip to Wiesbaden, and it was the worst thing that could have happened to him, because for the rest of his life, he kept trying to recreate that feeling of power, which is what he wanted, the feeling that he had control over his life, that he was no longer beholden to creditors or other people. So I wanted to fast forward to 1865. This is just before Dostoevsky starts to write Crime and Punishment. He's at another low point in his life. His wife, who was ill with tuberculosis, has just died. 3 months later, his brother, whom he loved, his older brother, Mikhail, also died, 3 months apart. His second magazine that he started with his brother also collapsed due to debts, mounting debts. And his response is the same, to do the same thing, to escape and to regain control over his life in Wiesbaden, Germany, at the casino. So here's just a brief description of that. He began winning. The system was working. There were, admittedly, a few blind spots. It's not exactly clear, for example, what one should calculate so calmly in roulette. So you calculate whatever you can. You look for streaks and patterns, missing numbers, hidden influences, momentum, and hot players, as if each spin of the wheel were not an isolated event, but a scene in a narrative. And in this particular narrative, Dostoevsky was alone, a novelist of some repute, gambling with the only money he had left, money taken from a villainous publisher and wrested from his departed brother's creditors. And he was on the verge of overcoming his great misfortunes until the croupiers began to rake his winnings away. And this narrative turn highlighted another rather large blind spot in Dostoevsky's gambling system. It never told him when to stop playing. When you are in the middle of a story filled with unexpected twists, you keep reading until there are no pages left. Who knows if this string of losses is the arrival of a protagonist's doom or merely a dramatic setback before his final triumph. So you keep going. You play every spin, you turn every page until you have lost and borrowed and pawned everything you own down to the last paragraph. Dostoevsky's closing sentence was his silver watch. He pawned it in Wiesbaden's lone pawn shop, and he lost that money too. He lost everything in 3 days. So you see the silver watch that he pawns is the silver watch that he decides to embed into Crime and Punishment, this little tiny detail. Whether or not his silver watch is also his own father's silver watch is something that I don't know. I searched endlessly to find out the origin of that silver watch. But after this disaster at the roulette tables, he had nothing left to do except write his way back home. So he had no money to pay the bill at his hotel. The hotel was threatening to call the police and have him arrested. He had no money to get back home. The hotel was not serving him meals. And what he decided to do was write a proposal for a short story, as he was calling it. It was not yet a novel, but it was a short story about a murder told from the murderer's perspective. And that short story would be Crime and Punishment.
Wow, and I think with all the little details and surprises that we get as we read, which is part of what you do so great in your writing, both in this and in your previous book about James Joyce and the banning of Ulysses. I'm curious, as a writer and as you researched, whether there was anything, maybe that watch was one of them, anything that surprised you, that you didn't already know. Obviously, you know a lot when you go into researching and then when you start writing, but was there anything that you came across as you were working on it that took you by surprise?
Yeah, there were a lot of surprises. So I'll just pick out one, which is partly related to gambling, since we've been talking about gambling. One of the things that we can piece together about Dostoevsky that we couldn't have done even 15 or 20 years ago is about the way his brain works, about the way the brain of anyone who has temporal lobe epilepsy might have worked. So we know through his own detailed descriptions of his own seizures that he most likely had temporal lobe seizures, temporal lobe epilepsy. And a neuroscientist used Dostoevsky as a diagnostic model for a syndrome called Geschwind syndrome. And the idea is that, if you have seizures over and over again in your temporal lobe, a lot of the functions that the temporal lobe is responsible for become overloaded, and it becomes almost too active. And one of the things that happens with people who have Geschwind syndrome are they have hypergraphia. So they write and they can't stop writing. They have to write constantly. They keep writing over and over again. They have extreme religious feelings or philosophical feelings, deep philosophical feelings. They also develop obsessive compulsive behaviors. And so there are a lot of people who have temporal lobe epilepsy, if it's untreated at least, where there may be a connection between that and gambling in particular. So it's quite possible that Dostoevsky's seizures played a role in the gambling addiction that he developed as he got older.
And in the writing and in kind of the compulsion, right? Or I guess that's hard to say when you're talking about a writer.
Right, yeah, so I don't go so far as to suggest that, and I don't really know, and it's a very difficult thing, I think, to try to assert, outside of the clinical setting. When you look at some people who have hypergraphia, you see them compulsively trying to fill a page, even if it means writing the same sentence over and over again. Now, Dostoevsky didn't do that. There are notebook pages of his that are really crammed with writing, but of course he was a writer, and so he was probably doing that anyway. But the connection to gambling is, I think, a little bit more persuasive, partly because it was just so pathological. When you go through his letters in his later life to his wife, his second wife, it's just heartbreaking to see, what he went through, what he was putting his family through in order to keep gambling.
Mhm. And I because of your book, I also learned that in his notebooks of writing, he also had really incredible drawings and sketches. At least they looked really incredible
Yeah,
to me. And I wonder how you place that in the way
yeah.
he kind of in his creative process.
Well, so his father wanted him to be an engineer, and as I mentioned earlier, he was at the engineering academy when his father died. But as an engineer in training, he was a draftsman, and so he was trained to draw, and that skill stayed with him, for the rest of his life. And he did often draw characters in the margins of his notebooks, and it's one of the things that fascinated me about his work. If you look closely at some of the pages of Crime and Punishment, you can see Raskolnikov. And Raskolnikov is drawn, I don't mention this in the book, and I think I should have. I think maybe it was too speculative for me to say anything definitive about. But if you look at the images of Raskolnikov, he has a receding hairline, which is strange for a young man. He's in his 20s. And if you look at the cover of my book, and if you look at all of the illustrations that Dostoevsky was looking at when he was looking into the Lacenaire case, Lacenaire also has a receding hairline. So that receding hairline is possibly something that he was thinking about. That image was probably something that he had in mind as he was composing Crime and Punishment.
Is it true, or is it just a rumor that you asked them to make this look more like you?
Yeah, I said, look, can you have like a little bit of a sneer, like the way I
Right.
sneer when I'm evil?
I like
But
that.
yeah, I wanted them to Photoshop my face into it, but they decided to stick with the original.
I wonder, the crime and again, to remind everyone to please add any questions or comments. We already have a nice selection of them under our Q&A button at the bottom, and in just in a few minutes, we'll switch over to that. I mentioned to you, Kevin, that I recently reread The Talented Mr. Ripley, which I think is very influenced. Well, I don't know for sure whether Patricia Highsmith was a reader of Crime and Punishment, but you see a lot of the same elements, which I think is probably true of just crime fiction.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, that is what you describe, or you include others describing Crime and Punishment being unique because it is a psychological portrait of crime, which at the time was sort of a new approach. So I wonder how that connects to pull the curtain back in your process when you tackled Lacenaire. So again, to remind everyone, that's the French murderer that Kevin is interweaving throughout his book, and is one of the inspirations for the creation of Crime and Punishment. How, one of the most challenging things as a reader and a writer of crime, in which the criminal is center stage, is reliability, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I wonder how you were able to weigh, if Lacenaire is the voice, who sort of wrote the way he experienced his crime, how difficult was that in reconstructing his actions and his case to sort of know what to trust?
Yeah. So Lacenaire is completely unreliable, and that's part of the dynamic that interested Dostoevsky. So, as I mentioned earlier, he wrote his memoirs, and his memoirs are part of what established him within the minds of the French public and what burnished his reputation for the next few decades and ultimately over the next century. Lacenaire wanted to depict himself as an altruistic murderer, someone who was murdering for the good of society. He murders a former prison mate of his and that prison mate's mother, a widowed mother. He ultimately wanted to take the money he was going to steal from them to rent out an apartment and to rent furniture in order to execute a larger bank robbery scheme. And the larger bank robbery scheme involved luring collection clerks from banks into these apartments and then to kill those collection clerks and take their money. So what he pretended, at least in his memoirs and in public, in interviews, because he was giving interviews, was that he was trying to right the wrongs of an unjust society. So one of the famous lines in his memoirs is, I come to preach the religion of fear to the rich because the religion of love has no power over their hearts. Now, this idea of a altruistic or revolutionary murderer was something that did captivate a lot of Paris at the time, and it would end up leading into some of the revolutionary violence that did take place in 1849, less than 2 decades later. Dostoevsky, what he ultimately took from Lacenaire and placed into Raskolnikov was this fantasy of a murderer who murders altruistically, but who deep down murders for nothing, murders for no reason whatsoever, who has no higher purpose. And it's that duality that he wanted to capture in Raskolnikov. For anyone who has read Crime and Punishment, if you close Crime and Punishment thinking that Raskolnikov is killed for some larger philosophical purpose, then that means Raskolnikov has successfully eluded your capture. Okay, he hasn't done that. The reason why he kills is, as he puts it to Sonia, his love interest, is to whisk everything off by the tail and just to cast it off to the devil, just to do it, just because there was that freedom, that quick moment of exhilaration that comes with complete destruction, complete annihilation. That was the feeling that he saw in the murderers that he talked to in Siberia. And that is the feeling I think he felt in himself, the desire to have some sort of freedom like that. And that's the feeling that that he gives us in Raskolnikov.
That's really helpful in terms of insights into how those pieces work together. I'm going to switch over to our questions from audience. Is that the right word when we're on Zoom? I think so. I just want to remind everyone that you can order Kevin's book through Harvard Bookstore. In what way? I don't know. I think, oh yeah, there's a link.
It's in the chat.
There's a link on the chat.
And by the way, I should mention that you can also buy Matthew Pearl's book, because Matthew, part of the reason why we're talking is because you've just written a book. It's called The Taking of Jemima Boone. Do you have?
We don't have to promote that.
Yeah, that's that's so you're one of the things that's interesting about you is that you are traditionally a novelist. You wrote multiple novels, and you've now started to write nonfiction. And I always used to joke with you that it was so much easier writing novels because you could just make everything up. And you said, no, it's so much easier writing nonfiction because the story is right there for you. All you have to do is tell it. And you've called my bluff, I suppose, by going ahead and writing nonfiction as well. And so it's a great story. It's a narrative history. And in a way, I think we're working in the same form, but we do it in very different ways. And I think part of it is because we have different subject matter and we have material that's just very different, and the archive is very different, but it gives us very different challenges. And maybe with some of the questions, we can get into what those challenges are and how we solve them.
Yeah, well, thank you for mentioning that too. And definitely part of the challenge of, well, first of all, my conclusion in terms of fiction versus nonfiction is pretty much that writing everything is difficult. So that's unfortunately my answer to that. But part of what's difficult about writing is I mean, it's a melodramatic word, I guess, but the loneliness of writing, right? So it's always helpful wherever you are as a writer to have another writer or writers who you can compare notes with and bounce ideas off of. And on that note, let's start jumping to some questions. Thanks to everyone who's been listening and anyone who wants to add a question or comment here. And I'm going to combine two of the questions from Joseph. since we were just talking about writing and publishing and bookstores, the importance of supporting our bookstores. Part of the story of the Sinner and the Saint is that world of publishing and the sort of challenges that come with it. And Joseph is wondering about the condition of publishing. If you could speak a little bit more of that in this period of Tsarist Russia, and also how Dostoevsky was cheated, if that's how you'd put it, by his publishers.
Yeah. So the environment was changing pretty rapidly, and that's partly due to the changing czars and partly due to what was happening in Europe at the time. So, I mentioned that Dostoevsky was arrested, and the reason why he was arrested is because his arrest took place in 1849, which is 1 year after the wave of revolutions just starts in Europe in 1848, beginning in Paris and spreading to nearly every capital in Europe. The protesters, the revolutionaries, were asking for many things. They were often asking for legislative assemblies or constitutions or democracies, or, the one thing they had in common was that they did not want the status quo anymore, and that traditional monarchies were not welcome, and they were not serving the people in the way that they might once have done. So the Tsar was paranoid about a revolution taking place in Russia, and so he tried to get ahead of the game and crack down as tightly as possible on any sign of dissent that might have been brewing in Moscow or St. Petersburg. And that included this very small reading circle that, it's called the Petrushevsky Circle, named after Petrushevsky, the man who hosted this semi-secret gathering. And the reason why I bring it up is because for Dostoevsky, the primary interest in this group was the fact that they had such a massive library of books that were forbidden. Petrushevsky worked for the government, and his position allowed him to get forbidden books that other people didn't have. And so Dostoevsky devoured all of these books that were filled with Western thinking. Some of it was utopian socialist, some of it was democratic, and he just loved reading these books. He did ultimately become vocally opposed to serfdom and was arrested for uttering statements that were the Tsar considered pernicious. But if you wanted to write a book in Russia in 1849, any sign that it was seditious would be quickly stamped out. Censorship was pretty powerful at the time. It was also chaotic. There were about 8 or 9 different censorship organizations, and they overlapped, and it could be passed. A book could be passed by one censorship organization and banned by another. The reading public was small. The literacy rate in Russia was small. It was certainly under 50%, probably under 25%. So in order for you to make a living as a writer, it was very, very difficult. And it was just starting to become a possibility for people. And Gogol was probably the best example of someone who was starting to be able to do that for Dostoevsky. He was writing books about Russians, about Russian life, and he was making money doing it. And that gave him the inspiration to try to be a writer himself. The other writers of Dostoevsky's generation were not of his social standing. They had much more money than he did. So Turgenev and Tolstoy, they had estates of serfs that were hundreds of serfs. So they could fall back on these estates and this family wealth. Dostoevsky did not have this family wealth to fall back on. So when he was young, when he was about 18, 19 years old, he renounced his estate for 1,000 silver rubles. The estate was in the control of his brother-in-law. And he said, give me this 1,000 rubles and I won't take anything else ever again. And he used that 1,000 rubles to support himself while he wrote his novella, Poor Folk. And then he was off to the races. He quickly found that it was very, very difficult to make a living as a writer. And he was always under the gun and always writing faster than he wanted to write. And he hated the fact that that happened. He called himself a proletarian writer, and he resented the fact that Tolstoy and Turgenev got to take their time writing whatever they wanted, whereas he had to rush as quickly as possible in order to pay his bills. So things started to loosen up a little bit in the 1860s. He wrote what's effectively a memoir, Notes from a Dead House, that's about his experiences in Siberia, but he had to dress it up as a novel. It was nominally fiction, but he knew how everyone would read it, which was the right way, which is that it was a memoir. But he couldn't publish that as a memoir. He had to publish it as a novel. But the fact that that was published at all was pretty remarkable and not something that would have happened in the 1840s.
I'm going to combine two more questions as well, just so we could try to fit more in. Francis is wondering about the process of writing Crime and Punishment and whether it evolved and changed over time. And I'm going to combine Francis's question with Steve's question about whether what we ultimately get in Crime and Punishment, does that give a perspective or commentary on Europe versus Russia, kind of the sort of larger cultural and political ideas of Dostoevsky?
Yeah, okay. So I guess I'll tackle the first question first. The drama of the creation of Crime and Punishment is something that I was very eager to capture, to sort of get into the creative mind of Dostoevsky, what it was like to write a novel like this. As I mentioned earlier, he initially thought of it as a long story, something that would be about 80 to 90 pages, but it very, very quickly spiraled out into something much, much bigger. The big challenge that Dostoevsky was trying to figure out was exactly what perspective it should be told from, because what he knew he wanted is to have the murderer's perspective, but he also knew that the murderer would be confused, that the murderer would get things wrong, that a murderer at the time of the murder is not remorseful at all, so you can't tell the story after the fact. His first idea was that it would be a diary confession, that is something that Raskolnikov was jotting down years after he had murdered someone. And he thought, no, that's not possible, because he's going to be recounting the story with some sense of clarity, and a sense of clarity that the murderer isn't going to have. So then he decides, well, maybe what if I bring the reader closer to the crime by having him on the witness stand, that he's actually at trial and he's recounting his story then. But it still didn't quite fit that first person perspective, someone who is logically putting together the story after the fact, didn't make sense. What he ultimately decided on was an attached third person perspective, where we're just over the shoulder of Raskolnikov and we're following him up the darkened stairwell as he muscles his way into the pawnbroker's apartment. We see what he sees. We experience the thrills, the fear that he experiences, the pounding heart, the hallucinations. So he hallucinates at various points. He has fever dreams. All of these confusing elements, all of this paranoia, that's something he wanted to create in real time, so that we're experiencing these things as they happen. And that's how he decided to ultimately write it. And so it seems like a foregone conclusion. And of course, anytime you read a novel, you're reading the end product of something. But that end product is something that took months, if not years, to create. And there were a lot of experiments that did not go as he planned. The other question, I'm trying to answer this succinctly. The question is about, in the 1860s in Russia, there was a big dividing line between whether or not Russia should become more European or whether they should honor their Slavic roots. And these two camps were getting further and further apart, more and more extreme. People who wanted a sort of revolutionary European idea of how to run Russia, and people who wanted a more powerful authoritarian czar. Dostoevsky wanted to strike a middle path. He wanted to take what was best from the tradition of Russia and combine what was best from the Western world. He was not opposed to science, he was not opposed to industrialization, but he wanted Russia to be cautious about it. Crime and Punishment enters that debate as an attempt to forge a middle path. And of course, it didn't work. If you were a radical, you thought that Crime and Punishment was derogatory to all radicals. They thought that Raskolnikov was an image of a radical, and that that Dostoevsky was calling all radicals murderers and cold-blooded. And that, of course, is not really the case. We're really supposed to see Raskolnikov as, deep down, he's good-hearted, but he's lost his way. He's sort of become isolated, and that detachment from his community is part of the problem. And so by being detached from other people, he sort of spins out this philosophy filled with Western ideas like utilitarianism about how to be good.
Maybe we'll do one last question, since we're getting to the bottom of the hour. I'll also just there's a comment that Stan made, fascinating insight into the mind of genius. And I assume he's talking about us, not Dostoevsky. So thank you to Stan for that. And then the last question we'll throw at you from Sarah is do you have a theme for your next book? I'm guessing you're probably not going to give away what your next book is. So maybe I would modify that question a little bit, if Sarah doesn't mind, to how can we follow you? Where can we go to kind of keep up with Kevin Birmingham exciting news? You're not a social media, much of a social media user. So how do we not lose track?
No, I do have my next book in mind. In fact, I've just signed the contract for it, so it is happening. I will say that it is also about literary history. It does also involve crime, and I'll leave it at that. If you're interested in what I'm up to next, you can go to my website, kevinbirmingham.net. kevinbirmingham.com is taken by, I think, a real estate agent. And you can sign up for, it's not really a newsletter, but you can sign up for updates. I will basically never email you unless or until I have my next book out. So that'll be a long time from now. So it's kevinbirmingham.net. It was just pasted into the chat. So thank you, Harvard Bookstore, for that.
Great. Well, I think we're going to throw it back to Serena, but thank you, Kevin, for letting me join you and for all the great insights into your book, and congratulations again.
Matthew, thank you for being a genius moderator.
This was so wonderful and just really riveting, and very engaged audience, which we love to see. So thank you both for being here and for this fascinating conversation. And thank you to all of you out there for tuning in and spending your evening with us. Please check out the books. We have links to both The Sinner and the Saint and Matthew's book, The Taking of Jemima Boone, in the chat. And I did also throw in the link to Kevin's website. So check those out. And again, thank you for being here on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Keep reading and stay well.